Hello everyone and welcome to my 9.2 tier list. It's been a while since the last one I covered originally in version 8.0, so today I want to finally update it and talk about what has changed since and where exactly I would rank certain options now that we have a much better understanding of the meta. Like with the last time, it's going to be mostly unedited and just be me rambling for as much as I have to say about these things, but I will give one disclaimer out of the way. I did a poll about this earlier on if I should just redo my explanations for the entire tier list or for the effort of time, skim quickly through sections that haven't largely changed much, and you guys voted on the former. So I will only briefly go over the lower half of mains and sub-weapons, and for the rest of the tier list we'll be going through things normally in more detail. I think that's the most efficient way to go through this. There will also be a separate video going over and ordering the top 10 weapons that should already be out by now. But with all that out of the way, this is my competitive Splat Zones only 9.2 tier list. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, and let's get started. For the sub-weapons, nothing has changed in terms of tier placements, and the only thing I really have to comment on is in the top half. I believe Burst is a more strong option due to the chip damage focused meta, and many top tier options using them or working with them. While by contrast, Fizzy Bomb overall paints a little bit worse due to its 9.2 nerfs and have moved it slightly lower. None of these are too drastic, and besides that, everything else holds true in my 8.1 tier list. So let's move on to the specials. So we're going to start off pretty similar to the last tier list, which is, once again, I don't have an F tier special pick. While I do think there are specials that are a lot weaker, I don't think anything is anywhere near as bad as even something like Splatoon 2 Splashdown or Autobomb Rush, for instance, when compared to the other specials. Everything has some degree of usefulness. That said, the bottom of the barrel is still an ink vac. Unfortunately, I think things have only gotten, if anything, slightly worse for it, mainly because swords are more common now, and swords are very good into ink vacuum. It still has all the problems I talked about in my last tier list and my own video on it, which is that it's way too slow, it prevents you from taking space quickly, it's very easy to punish at different times, stuff like that. It already has a lot of different problems that I've gone over. I will say that it does occasionally have its moments, though. Being able to paint zone is still pretty useful for it, and at least it can kind of be okay into HP stuff. I think in particular it's pretty nice in a Booyah Bomb, but for the most part it's still a big downside. However, a big difference compared to last time is that VAC is not the only weapon in this tier. While it is the worst special in the game, I'm going to put Splatter Color Screen right next to it this time. I debated if I wanted to move this up or down, but I think that this is mostly fair because I think every other special that was previously ranked closer to Screen has gotten better indirectly, and so I personally just think Screen has dropped off a little bit by comparison. For the most part, I don't have too much to say about this special either. I think the limited field of view is much less impactful now that there's more shorter range weapons like S-Blast with its reliable short range mode, or Edit being able to strafe around it, or HP specials that have, ways of just tanking through it. Screen has basically no object damage, its lingering effect isn't that impactful. The best part about it is the 40 damage that you could still parry to get through. It could be annoying on very good weapons like Squeezer, and I think it's good with roller comps, but even with both of those, I've basically never really seen it lately, so yeah. Super Chump and Wave Breaker. Both of these are also very similar in terms of being specials that are very easy to use and kind of just act as an extra player on the field for a little bit, but do them in different ways. Wave has a little bit shorter of a cooldown, much better damage combos if hit by it, and has a very nice location effect, particularly with the starting 1.5 seconds initial mark. That's a lot more difficult to avoid. However, the waves are very easy to ignore, and more swords equals more object shredding damage for the Wave Breaker to deal with, unfortunately. Super Chump, on the other hand, has definitely dropped off a little bit more. I think it had much more of an argument in the previous meta in 8.1 because there was a lack of paint in comps, and so having the ability to have a lot more paint on a special was more valuable, but these days that kind of thing isn't as useful. Comps have a lot more paint or ways of working around it, and so that big value isn't there, so you're left with a special with a very large cooldown, a very long detonation time, and a damage radius that, while not bad, is often not going to find many targets, and a lot of the other specials can be very effective into it. If there's something like a slider or a tri-strike being able to be used, it'll often counter the special while getting much more value. So overall, I think this is a fair ranking for these. So next up on the ranking is Kraken. I've previously held a good bit of critiques for Kraken because you lose a lot of pressure from whatever main weapon you have to be a Kraken, and oftentimes you're just chasing around one player where there's heavy potential for 3v3s. However, I do think Kraken has some things that it's good at. In particular, I think it can be very useful at dealing with HP specials. So Booyah Bomb, Crab Tank, and recalls like Zipcaster are still pretty good for it, and there are a lot more options that are going to have those specials in a comp. In addition to that, Kraken synergizes very well with these types of specials, since obviously its survivability is even better than those, allowing you to tank when needed, and the recall can be useful for regroups to the special. That being said, it's still a very risky option, all things considered, especially when fighting opponents who are tactical, they can QSJ away or have very good movement speeds, and since Kraken's 5-frame nerf, chasing people down with it can be very difficult, so it requires proper timing and oftentimes coordination from teammates. I'd say the main downside outside of everything I've talked about so far is honestly its retake value is very low. Losing out on paint and distance pressure to get in to be a Kraken is very difficult, and oftentimes it is the easiest point in the game to get stranded during the Kraken end lag, which is another point to bring up. The startup and end lag of the special is more than pretty much any other HP option in the game, so it's something you have to be very careful of as well, and it just adds to the long list of factors that can make the special quite difficult to get value out of at the highest level. That being said, again, I think the addition of HP specials and the type of comps we're seeing is making Kraken a little bit better indirectly, but the special itself still has a lot of problems, so I think the top of C tier seems fair. Next up in B tier, we're gonna start with the Inkjet. It feels like every time I talk about the special, it gets a little bit lower on the tier list, even though nothing has really changed directly outside of Bubble being a little bit better into it. I think that there's still just too many answers to deal with it. I still think Pen is very annoying. I think these days Crab has a slight matchup advantage into it. Bubble is very good at it, Strike can camp landings, Booyah can tank it. I don't think any of these matchups are particularly horrible special-wise, and even the main weapon ones aren't that bad outside of like Pencil and Squeezer. But for the most part, I think Inkjet is still very high risk without a whole lot of consistency compared to when it had its old radius, and I think that pretty much every good comp right now has a way of dealing with Jet, so you have to be very good at hitting precise shots in order to get consistent value out of it. I think a lot of times that's a little bit too much to ask. Up next will be Inkstorm. Like with Chump and Wavebreaker, this is also a very minimal effect on a bit of a cooldown, but this one does have a bit of an advantage to where I think its effect is more impactful. It's a large radius that does a relatively consistent amount of damage and paints the floor at the same time. There's no real way to stop it from impacting the area it's set up in compared to the other two options, and the effect it has on that area is a little bit more strong, especially if you have weapons that can take advantage of the unique healing effect it has, though there aren't that many of them that are very prominent right now, to be honest. Most of them are fast enough to use Squid Form for healing or have alternate methods of moving around. So basically, Storm is here because of the cooldown and not having much of a power stat to be higher, but I do think compared to a lot of the other specials that you kind of just use and it acts like a little bit of an extra half player for you, this one has a much more consistent impact. I wish the others would be similar to this one in power, if not probably slightly higher, considering they have much more counterplay options available against them. Up next is going to be Ultra Stamp, ranking a lot more highly than before, and as a lot of you might know by now, this is mostly because of the buff it got to its throw mode. The throw mode got quite a substantial buff where it got a larger hitbox for its one shot and its 60 damage hitbox, which I think is pretty good. Obviously, Hammer has some limitations, but I think it was already shifting a little bit upward. Not too much because the meta's introduced more things that it can do well against, mainly just some specials. I think it's pretty good into stuff like Crab or maybe Shredding Bubble if you get up close, stuff like that. And that buff has also made it even better at that. The 220 hitbox is so large that it's very good at breaking Crab now, where it was a little precise before. I don't think it's anywhere near as insane as something like a Zuka shot. Like, obviously, Zuka has multiple shots, the ability to hit around terrain, etc. But you now have to respect the fact that they could just throw Stamp at you, so you are a little limited where you can stand if they are threatening that. And I think Stamp is also just still quite a fluid special between its different modes, so you can pop it, use it to stall a little bit, then throw it, or you could pop it, use it up close, Something like that. It definitely gets more value out of weapons like Wellstring or Wiper that naturally have damage numbers that will combo with the 60 throw or the 40 shockwaves. But for the most part, I think it has some potential here. A lot of B tier is very situational value that might backfire with Jet, Stamp, and the special we have above this. But, you know, I already explained why Storm is in this tier as well. But I'm putting Stamp here because I think after the patch, the potential for playmaking is actually higher than something like Jet, or at least if Jetpack is going to be comparable to this, which it could be, it's because it's going to require special power-up, whereas Stamp basically doesn't require any gear investment, and I think it's just a little bit less risky. Jetpack's a bit more of a commitment, so because of that, I think it could work very well on some of the higher value main weapons. Again, stuff like Wiper, Wellstring would be what I'd talk about there. And yeah, it's good to see it move up. Definitely still middle of the pack in terms of specials. It's nothing crazy, but yeah. And finally, rounding out this tier is Triple Splashdown. I still think the special can be very good into objects, if anything even more so. You can kill Booyah Bomb in the Booyah armor, you can kill Crab in it, you can kill through Bubble, but you do have to be up close to be able to use it. That, on top of the splashdown options being very limited, is why we don't see too much of it. Super Jump Splashdown is still pretty much a joke. You would always still splash down just upon your landing instead of using it beforehand so that you still get the fists. I think that some weapons do have more mobility to deal with it these days compared to previously, and there are some specials that can still also deal with triple splashdown, even if it's better into some of the HP stuff. Things like Crab, Booyah Bomb, etc. can still be used from a safe distance, and you still have to worry about other options like Trizuka being able to punish you. That said, I think this is one of the most underlooked specials in my opinion. It is still very powerful at what it does, and if a triple splashdown can be set up in the right spot, sometimes it can feel like there is very little you can do against it. It did also get a slight buff, 11% better painting, which I'm not going to act like it's useless or anything, but it's not a giant change by any means. It mostly just helps with painting zone. It could even cheese some of the zones, if you want to call it cheese. I don't know, if you get to the center of the zone, splash down, and they don't shoot any of the 3 things they can shoot down, it's kind of on them. So, sure, I guess it helped a little bit. That said, in between B and A tier is where I would start to say there's a bit of a power gap. I think every special above this point has either potential for major value or consistent value. With the higher up we get in the list, the more likely you get both of them combined. So that brings me to Whale and Missiles being next up on this tier. Obviously, another pair of very similar specials we're talking about with long-range global displacement and location power. Missiles gives you a little bit more value since the location is a lot easier to work off of and call out to teammates. You can locate all 4 players. The missiles being able to target 1 or 2 people is often a better displacement effect than Whale. The outside hit doing 30 or 50 is very good at comboing with everything right now, and a little bit of extra pain output doesn't hurt. It's definitely noticeable from my experience at a high level play, especially since I've used a bit of Flingza lately, that missiles are still an incredibly impactful special when they're out. And honestly, if their output kept up, I think it would probably be about an S tier, if not maybe even X tier special. However, the reason it's lower is of course the 10-second cooldown, paired with a high points for special on pretty much all missile weapons, and the output of these is pretty much the lowest in the game in terms of specials. Not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but in terms of an entry special, I do think it's a little too harsh right now. The only special that really works around having a 10-second cooldown is Tacticooler, and that's mostly because Tacticooler lasts so ridiculously long that you don't really notice it. I think that 8 seconds is probably a good maximum for any other cooldown that isn't Tacticooler. That said, Missiles is still quite valuable. Whale, on the other hand, doesn't have too many advantages worth pointing out. It's a little bit easier to use it in the middle of combat compared to Missiles, though not by that much, and it has a shorter cooldown that you can also cycle more easily if you die in it, since you can retain some of the special charge. But because of all of that, you get a slightly weaker special in all of the other areas. I would actually say that Missiles is technically slightly better here. I think I'd rather have the more impactful special when it counts, and I think its damage numbers being a little bit more consistent makes it work better with some of the meta options in the game, but they're obviously very close. I'd say where these specials really thrive is just their consistency though. You can't really do much to avoid being targeted by them, so you're very likely going to get the value you're looking for. And then rounding out A tier would be Reef Slider. So I already ranked the special pretty high in my last one, so I feel like I've said a lot about it paired with the slider guide, but this special is very high risk, high reward. You can go in and 70 the entire team, get a random double kill, cap the zone, blow up HP specials, or you might just die. Cooler is definitely the main thing that saves the special. Without Attack the Cooler, this would be like a C tier special, maybe low B tier at best. The ability to insta-QSJ out is extremely valuable. It's not unpunishable, but it's very difficult to punish, and that gives Reef Slider a way out of its biggest weakness, and that's a huge thing for it. That being said, you're oftentimes going to have to make the situation of either not using Reef Slider whenever you don't have Cooler, which can get predictable and mess up your special timing, or you're going to just have to use some Reef Sliders without Attack the Cooler. So the mileage may vary based off the weapon. Still, I think the moments where Reef Slider does work, it gets similar value to some of the better specials in the game. The reason it's lower here is because, well, there are a lot of times where it does much worse in terms of value than anything else here at the same time, and that inconsistency, especially on retake, can be a problem. Up next into S tier, we have a bit of the old guard from last time with Tri-Strike and Trizooka. I'd rank Tri-Strike just a little bit higher, but like I've said with a few of these, I don't have too much to add to them because they're in virtually the same spot, with the only real major change being that Zuka has slightly more startup than last time. Zuka can still be a little bit inconsistent when finding kills, but gets the trade-off of having more HP specials it's better into, primarily Crab Tank and especially Booyah Bomb being good matchups for it. I think the startup isn't too big of a nerf, and it can still find important kills throughout the game while having a consistent AoE to hit. Now, the patch obviously did nerf it, which is a big factor of why it dropped down to the bottom of this tier. It is a little bit less consistent, but 35 is still an alright damage number if you're working with other options, and the 53 hitbox is still not small by any means. In addition to that, I also think just in terms of going against specials, it doesn't feel too different. Like, it's still going to be great against stuff like Booyah Bomb or Crab Tank, so for the most part, it retains a lot of the use cases it has. It's just more inconsistent, and its inconsistency was already somewhat of a problem before, so I think it drops down here. Tri-Strike, on the other hand, is mostly just suffering from not being able to act as a form of active sustain, with those being very powerful with other HP specials right now, as well as being a bit easier to run down and get outpaced compared to before when there was a lot more open windows to be able to use your strike more safely. That said, still the most broken painting special in the game. High object damage can still work into some HP specials if timed properly, even if it doesn't share their sustain value. And it also just blinds a lot of the screen at the same time, making it better for approaches than Splatter Color Screen, which is supposed to blind the screen for its effect. Just found that funny. Also, I'm just going to put this out there, I'm ranking Screen without the disability factors playing a part of it. Now with X tier, we have our top 5 specials, and number 5 is going to be the Big Bubbler. This is the first of our main HP specials we're going to talk about here, and pretty much everything from here is going to be related to that. What makes Big Bubbler worse than all of the other options is pretty simple. Its retake value is a little bit harder. Not that bad if you stack it with pretty much any other main weapon able to move forward with it, or other specials. It can make it really easy to put a foothold down, but if you need a special to take some space in the first place, that's the one time Big Bubbler kind of struggles. Some specials can deal with it more effectively, such as other HP specials like Booyah Bomb and Crab Tank being able to tank and counter other HP specials. But for the most part, I think that Big Bubbler's high HP and quicker activation use compared to those two in terms of it being effective, since Crab needs to charge up and Booyah needs to charge up, gives it some important utility, and I think being able to stand in some areas while keeping access to your main weapon is still incredibly valuable for some options. In particular, I think it's underrated for getting pencil into very aggressive positions. Booyah Bomb and Crab Tank I'll talk about at the same time. This is my last little pair together, and these are both going to be pretty similar, because these are HP specials that can also counter other specials or help with entry. In Booyah Bomb's case, it's a little bit of a hybrid with Strike, not painting as well or as fast, but still covering a very large area and forcing people away from it, while also being able to tank with a lot of HP. You are susceptible to being Booyah-teched or one-shot by weapons like swords or rollers on your landing, but for the most part, I don't think that's too big a deal if you position accordingly, and the buff did a lot for it. The radius is noticeably larger. 5% radius doesn't sound like a lot, but it's already quite large, and of course, diameter matters overall. And in addition to that, the faster charge speed and being able to instantly shred bubble makes its matchups very good, since it's already obviously fine at camping recalls like Zipcaster, as well as breaking Crab Tank. I think its biggest weakness is dealing with Tri-Strike and Trizooka. You do have to make sure you're effectively using it beforehand. However, for the most part, that's only going to be one of the specials you're going to be dealing with most of the time, so I think you're more likely to find other good matchups in which this special's gotten a lot better. Crab Tank has a lot of similar attributes. Obviously, it doesn't share the hybrid nature with something like Tri-Strike. Instead, it has a bit of a turret mode for controlling space or AoE around corners. I think Crab's 30 AoE hit is especially good at working with a lot of the common meta options right now, and I have to shout out top players getting better at using Crab Tech in order to turn around and move more effectively when dealing with flanks. For the most part, I think Crab just has a little bit more potential. It's a bit faster to use, you're a little bit less vulnerable, you have more options, a bit more HP, and a little bit more utility, but that said, you definitely miss out on the pain output sometimes compared with Booyah Bomb. And it does take up your main weapon for a little bit more time, which can occasionally be bad if that main weapon needs to take space, or creates overlap with something like Pen. I'm going to put Zipcaster in the middle of these two. This is mostly talking about Zip Sword. I think most other casters would be over here, like if we're talking about Lunas or Octobrush or Tetras. Maybe Bucket Caster would be up here, but we never really see it anyway. Zipcaster's a little bit high risk, high reward, but I think it's good to think of this like an HP special. You can pop it and use the arm armor in addition to your mobility to have heavy survivability. In addition to that, especially when paired with Stamper, you can deal with all the other HP specials. You can zip through and break bubble, you can shred and Booyah Tech Booyah Bomb, and you can force Crab to turn around, break it, or headshot it. However, it comes with more risk, and that's the reason Crab is a little bit higher this time for me. I think as people have gotten better with Crab, it just gets a little bit more consistent value than Caster. Caster has a little bit higher highs, but lower lows. Sometimes you do still die in it without finding a lot of value, though that is rare at higher levels. But for the most part, I think that Zipcaster is still a pretty good special. It's very hard to take it down with its mobility. It's good into a lot of other weapons and specials, and in particular, finds its synergy with and against other HP specials. Finally is Tacticooler. This one is identical to the previous video, except the double cooler is a little bit weaker. I'd rank the second cooler out of two in like an A tier, I guess, low A tier. I'd still say I'd label it as a necessity in comps, to be honest. At the very highest level, I do think you realistically should be running one, but I'm not going to pretend like you can't make cooler lists work if you really want to. I just think there's a good reason that most players at that level aren't bothering to try. Stacking the special is a little bit more tricky because there's more HP specials to be able to tank against you and wall you out, so you do need your own specials in order to get back in and deal with them, since having more coolers effectively means having less options to shred HP stuff. But other than that, it still helps you get your specials, keep up the pacing advantage, works with pretty much every meta weapon. You know the deal by now. Everyone gets why Tacticooler is good. Very easy buffs to grab that last a very long time and drastically improve the pacing of the game for the better, which is very useful. So of course it's going to be the top of this list. So yeah, I think the upper end has moved around a little bit, but for the most part I don't have too much to say compared to last time, so hopefully this was a little bit better paced. I think the main shift is just that HP specials are more powerful, they naturally synergize with each other, but compared to like Crab meta when this happened, I think they're more susceptible to counterplay and there's more options that are equipped to deal with them. Sadly, this isn't the reality we live in, but if there were more kits with options like missiles, Reef Slider, Trizuka, Tri-Strike, etc., or even weaker options like Triple Splashdown or Kraken, I think that the grip they would have on the meta would be even more toned back than it already is. But that being said, I still think they're pretty well balanced. I think that specials generally feel pretty fun to use and feel like they have the proper impact on the game, so that's cool. Now we can jump into the mains, and the lower half of those haven't changed very much. Though for this ranking, I decided to try and condense the bottom half into 2 tiers instead of 3. So the E and F tiers listed here are mostly the same weapons that have basically never been seen in tournament play as the D, E, and F tiers in my previous ranking. E tier has slightly more potential due to generally stronger main weapons or having a piece in a kit that's better, though are generally still not worth it over other options and have major flaws. Any weapons not in these 2 tiers, even if they were in the previous 3 last time, will get more information about their new placement. But anything shown right here, like with subs, has the exact same issues as stated before. The only one of these where I have anything else to add on, honestly, is GooTuber, since it did get a 3-frame charge speed buff for its first ring one-shot kill, which so far has resulted in 0 use at top level play in either scene that I could find. So unfortunately, I can't really change the main weapon's placements very much, and nothing else has changed pretty much at all. Also, a change that I'm going to do in this list compared to the previous one is that I'm going to talk about both variants of the same weapon at the same time. I think that'll just be a little bit easier. So let's start with Custom Splattershot Junior, and later we'll go into Normal Junior. So as a main weapon, I think that Junior is very similar to what I talked about last time. While it has good paint output, its painting range is very limited. and it struggles a little bit at fighting. I think the support weapons are trending more and more into being able to fight, rather than in the previous tier list where we talked a lot about weapons being able to paintbot more effectively, since the main weapons were more powerful at fighting, and it was more important to just keep consistent turf on the ground. So overall, I'd say Junior as a main weapon has definitely gotten a little bit weaker and faces a bit more harsh competition. Now, the kits can definitely help with that, and both of these do have pretty unique ones. I'd say that Custom Junior is definitely a weaker one. It has some potential, since Wave and Torp are both capable of locating people, and having to deal with both Torp and jumping over Wave could be a little bit threatening. However, the special is just very mediocre in terms of its balance right now at absolute best, which really prevents there from being many stages where this weapon would be useful. Mainly, we see this on Flounder Height zones, because the ability for Wave to hit all of the walls people have to climb up on is very useful for it, and that big initial point sensor effect is great at initially clearing trench and making sure no one is hiding down there. If you throw Wave on the pillow there, it's one of the best spots for it in the game. Overall, Custom Junior has a toolkit that makes sense, but is very underpowered in terms of both main and special weapon. The one that gets typically ranked a lot higher is the Vanilla Junior, and a lot of this weapon's success hinged on how good dive was going to be. For the most part, it's completely dropped off. Dive isn't really a thing we see traditionally, but I'll talk about that more when we get to dualies, and that comp is much more limited now. It's still okay, and its other use is, of course, just being a bubble spamming weapon. However, I'd argue the main weapons that get more out of their bubbles, like Mint Decavitator, Roller, or even Zinc Mini Splatling if you want to go for the same role, are all a lot more arguable in terms of their viability. Junior does have access to a lot of bombs compared to Zimmy not having one, which does weigh Zimmy down a bit, but overall I think Junior has consistently dropped off a little bit more. I'd still say support is better on fighting weapons, there's more competition for it, and Junior struggled for the same things I listed with C Junior in terms of it not being able to fight as well, so when its competition is very good against it, considering stuff like Neo Splash and V Splash have many answers for its bubble, I just think the main weapon is not able to compensate, and it's only dropping lower. Now originally this was going to go into A tier, but with the 9.3 changes, I'm inclined to give it a little bit more faith. Obviously the mint nerfs help, and then a little bit more bubble and a little bit better combat helps. I'm definitely going to end up being a little more optimistic with my S tier rankings this list. It did just kind of end up being for a lot of weapons that they could be S or A, and I tended to think positively about them unless if I didn't have a reason to believe otherwise, and so with those buffs, I think I'll give Junior an S ranking. Next up on our list is the Vacuum 96 Gal. So 96 as a main weapon is one that I think is okay, though it very much needs a toolkit built around it properly in order to thrive. I think that the main weapon is alright since it has some good damage output if it hits a bullet, and being able to combo off a little bit more weapons like Mint, and I think it works pretty well with Edit, is pretty good. However, the weapon's mobility is extremely limited, and without a good kit featuring a splash wall, it's really hard to give it much matchup props here. In addition to that, it comes with Ink Vac, which is one of the weakest specials in the game, and is especially struggling more since both Mint Decavitator and Splatana Stamper are more common right now, meaning there are active swords to be able to deal with the Vacuum. I'd say that Vacuum has a little bit more synergy in terms of stacking with other HP specials for sustain, but it's definitely a lot weaker than those. It gains a little bit more use against Booyah Bomb if it can get close enough to them, which I guess is useful against S-Blast in particular, but for the most part you're really grasping at straws with this weapon. It's a supportive type weapon with no bomb, very limited mobility, and an extremely weak special, and the only reason it's this high up is the main weapon being as solid as it is. Now 96 Gal Deco, on the other hand, is a little bit harder of a weapon to rank, because obviously the wall gives it a bit of usefulness, and while it does compete with similar wall weapons like Squeezer, the paint output of the weapon is a lot more consistent, though still not super good. I think the main thing that's changed really is the Kraken. Kraken does stack very well both with and against HP specials, and it seemed a little bit stronger to me recently. We haven't seen it too much in tournament play, but it's not seeming to be a big hindrance there. However, I'd still argue that while the special has more synergy, it's a little bit on the lower half. At the end of the day, while 96 and its wall synergy is very useful, and the paint output it has compared to Squeezer is better in some situations, the overall weaker special, as well as limited main weapon mobility, still makes it a little bit slow and rotating around the map, and creates a lot of points of the game where it's going to struggle a bit more. And while flexibility on weapons like the extra paint is typically pretty useful, I'd argue that having a weapon really stack into a particular role is even better. Look at how much success Neo Splash tends to see just because it's really good at painting and nothing everything else. And in this case, I think 96's fighting capabilities isn't quite on par with some of the other options. And so yeah, I'm gonna rate it this highly. Up next is both Jet Squelchers. I'm going to rank them both at D tier here. I think Vanilla Jet finds a little bit more use in niche situations on maps where vacuum is a bit better, such as Brine Water Springs, but Custom Jet Squelcher is a little bit stronger and more well-rounded of a kit overall. I still think the main weapon of these is solid. It paints from pretty far away, does a good combo damage number, and is able to play quite quickly with a lot of other strong meta options. As a main, I think this really does keep up a lot better than people think. However, it just has some of the worst kits in the game. Dart and Vac not only has no sub-special synergy, but is the weakest of both subs and specials, and while V-Jet can get a lot of them, having a lot of something bad isn't particularly useful, and Custom Jet, while also being 180, has a 8-second cooldown to prevent it from really spamming too many specials, and while Inkstorm is by far better than anything else on either of the Jet Squelcher's kits, it's still a very mediocre special that has effects that don't really cause any urgency for the players dealing with them. Overall, it sucks to see a main weapon that could be played in a very interesting way bogged down by such horrible kits, but unfortunately this is just where Jet Squelcher is, where it's basically praying for either a drastic ink vacuum buff or a third kit in order to have a chance of showing up in comp. Next up is Splattershot Nova, which I only have to talk about this one since we have already ranked the Vanilla Splattershot Nova. This is one I don't have too much to talk about. I do think it still has the best Inkjet out of all the jetpack weapons, since you have enough gear freedom to run enough special power-up to have a more consistent blast radius, as well as having an 8th shot after it, which is pretty notable. However, there's still no shortage of things that deal with Inkjet. I guess Squeezer being a little bit weaker and Range Blaster being a little bit weaker does make it a little bit easier to use it, but really the main thing shutting them down is Pencil, and with Rapid Pro being more common with edit comps, even edit comps have a really good answer against it. Again, I think Jetpack has trended a little bit further up, but with Nova being 210, I would argue it doesn't even really get an insane amount of them. It still doesn't have a lethal bomb, and its main weapon is still a 5-shot that's not going to work off of most other options. So while the Inkjet might be a little bit better these days than it was before, I think the main weapon is still struggling, and there is a lot of things that can go wrong at the same time. Next up is Vanilla L3, another one we only have to talk about the regular kit for since L3D was ranked lower. This weapon is really just the best crab spammer in the game, and that's really all it has going for it. While the main weapon does do better damage now, with 31 working off of most other options if you hit one bullet, the main weapon strengths just really aren't a lot to see it getting picked, especially when Curling Bomb is much weaker than the Burst Bomb Vanilla Splash has. A little bit extra painting range and better damage is notable, but not enough to really rank it any higher. At some point, just being really good at spamming a special isn't that great. Unfortunately, I really only see this weapon having a big future with the L3D kit if Stamp is ever buffed. I think that Burst Bomb is practically essential in order to making this main weapon feel very strong, due to having an option to threaten one burst as a kill. But this one just doesn't have any access to it, and I just don't think the crab spam is that valuable. Up next is Gold Dynamo Roller. Speaking of a weapon that's struggling between two different roles, far too slow to be a Slayer, but still having a paint value that's overall too weak to be a proper support. While its paint is a little bit more consistent now, its paint total output is actually a little bit lower than before, even if just by 1 point. The kit of this weapon isn't doing it too many favors. I think Splat Bomb can be useful for it sometimes. The Dynamo's usually going to be pretty active with its main weapon, and Super Chump is okay. You're not going to get a whole lot of them because of the cooldown, but at least it's only 180 points for special. For the most part, very mediocre main and special weapon package isn't going to do too much for it. And I don't think Vanilla Dynamo pairs much better. I'm going to just put this in C. I do think getting cooler can allow it to see use for a few maps like Flounder, where you can argue the anchor isn't as worth it, but even then we've been seeing Pen and Edit do fine on that map, and Try Nouveau is also another option. I unfortunately think this main weapon's cooler output is still just a little bit too low, its overall paint output is a bit too low, and as a full-on Slayer, it's still just too slow to function. The Vertical Flick is another area on this weapon that's still completely lacking. Even more in this meta, you basically have no time to actually use it. This leaves it as a weapon with a very lost identity. I think its current combat capabilities would be fine if it was actually a support, but it seems like we are never getting actual paint buffs to this weapon at this point, which just leaves it in a very mediocre position, which is a damn shame. Up next in the rollers, we have the foil Flingza roller. So I think that Flingza as a main weapon is doing a bit okay right now. It's just a little bit too weak in my eyes to be considered a strong main weapon, but it's a lot closer. The horizontal flick is a pretty consistent 2-shot, one-shot and can one-shot from a decent range now. The vertical flick still paints a lot and doesn't have too much downtime. It's pretty easy to stack sabers into it. However, both of those combined are still a bit in that hybrid role where it doesn't really excel too well at either option, and this kit is trying to make it a bit of a slayer with Suction Bomb and Splatter Color Screen, which I think it can use its screen okay if it absolutely has to, but it's not the strongest special for it, and Suction Bomb is fine, but not as good a combat sub as other options. I think this leaves this roller a little bit half-baked in both areas. If I wanted a roller sharking in with a screen, I'd much rather just pick a screen weapon alongside vanilla roller, where its better kill power, curling bomb, and ability to set up bubbler if it gets up close are much more threatening. And if I wanted the backline support paint style, I guess that's where it's a little bit more unique, but at that point I would rather pick the vanilla Flingza roller. And that's where we talk about Flingza. I'm going to put this one very quickly into B tier. I think that it mostly excels being paired with Edit, as Edit can be more aggressive to cover it, and Flingza's Ink Mines can help a lot with making it tough to rush down, but it's definitely more of a support. Sometimes it'll shark in aggressively, but the main thing holding it back is really just the missile cooldown. It prevents you from getting a whole lot of them, so the ability to use missile on a retake and have another one on the hold is much more limited compared to something like most other supports, which can usually get their special if they need to use it for hold as well. I think that paired with Flingza being a little bit in the middle of the road in terms of main weapons is just not a strong enough game plan to be worth it, though I do still think it's good enough to win, and again, still does work pretty well with edit comps at enabling that weapon, even if I think Rapid is overtaking it a bit for a similar role of trying to have a more supportive weapon. Obviously this one does do the paint, so it's a little bit different, and obviously being the best missile option is still a great title to hold, but I just hope the main weapon gets a little bit better in the future. Next up is the Squiffers. This will be another weapon where both are ranked in the same tier. I think that new Squiffer has a little bit more potential since the Zipcaster can be pretty useful for bigger kill streaks if you hit your shots, but classic Squiffer is a little bit more consistent. While Big Bubbler still isn't totally safe since you need to hit a shot, it is much easier to control space with it than it is with Caster. The sub-weapons are very even to me. Both have location tools. New Squiffer has a little more flexibility with the bomb, while classic Squiffer specs into better and more direct location. But for the most part, I think the main weapon is really struggling. Having a charge time similar to Edit, Spotlight, or Pencil means it's tough to stack into those comps. Zap isn't in the best spot in order for cooler lists to really be something that you could try out. And the other cooler options are unfortunately just a bit too weak. I think in particular Tri Nouveau is probably the cooler weapon this one wishes it could have, since Tri being able to fizzy at a distance would help with its range disadvantage, while at the same time the threat of a Tri-Slosher would stop a lot of weapons from running in and being greedy against it, but unfortunately with its cooler output being gutted, we're really only seeing Tri Nouveau as a secondary cooler option, which unfortunately really hurts this. I think the main weapon is still a lot more solid than people give it credit for. It can keep up with most of the midline fighting weapons, even if it's a little bit weaker, but in terms of comps and what you can actually run it with, the options are just incredibly limited, and while the kits are okay, they're not exceptional in any way, which leaves the weapon in a spot where it's not really super worth it. Speaking of Tri-Slosher, the vanilla one is up next in D tier. Really just, again, the kit on this thing is really, really bad. I don't think you can spec into a whole lot of inkjet stuff when you need all this quick respawn, and Mist just doesn't help the weapon out in any ways. I think Mist Tri is one of the least synergistic sub combinations they could have ever done. It just doesn't really work out for it. It needs something to help with its range disadvantage. You don't need to trap people when the main weapon already can kill you so quickly with such a consistent hitbox. Which leaves Tri Nouveau as the main one really being worth talking about in the first place, and I'm gonna have to put this one into B. I really wish it could be higher in A tier, but its use case is really only in niche situations right now. We see it on maps it's strong at like Barnacle, Flounder, and Sturgeon, mainly short range maps, or maps with a lot of terrain that benefits Tri and Fizzy Bomb as a potential second cooler option that can prevent rushdowns and be decently aggressive. However, at 210p with a nerfed Fizzy, its cooler output is gutted, and the true potential of this weapon is in single cooler comps where it isn't paired with another cooler weapon, because double cooler just isn't really something you want to see too much right now. And so I think unfortunately Tri just isn't in a position where it has the best options available to it. Still good enough to be used in niche situations, but it's struggling to find a reason to be picked in anything more than that. Up next is Explosher, another main weapon that's struggling a little bit more. I would argue it does see some use in edit compositions. That would be the main way where it gets some value. However, this kit isn't going to be the one to make it work. It doesn't seem like a bad kit on paper, and it's kind of not, but it doesn't really have anything special about it. I think that point sensor, while useful for locating people, isn't something Explo has the time to really use as much as it would really like to, and Inkstorm isn't a special it can cycle a whole lot of, or is very powerful, though it at least stacks with Explo's high painting power. I think the true potential of this kit lies in custom Explo, and even being as biased as I possibly can toward this weapon, I can't see it higher than a B tier. Despite Edit's popularity, we aren't seeing a whole lot of it. This is a very interesting middle ground between the Flingza playstyle we talked about earlier and the Rapid one, where you get the best of both worlds, where you get a little bit of paint and a little bit of chip damage, but compared to those, it just doesn't seem to be doing as good a job as either in their specific category. In terms of its painting, it doesn't manage to get a useful special, and in terms of chip damage, Rapid is a bit better at chasing people. I still very much believe in Explo's main weapon. Its ability to trap people and work off of other combo subs is good, but I think the main problem, again, is the weapon kit. Triple Splashdown is much better for it than Inkstorm, since it can prevent people from rushing you down, and again, synergizes very well with other options, and Wall is something that's okay for it when it has the ink efficiency to do so, like if Last Ditch Effort is active. But as a whole, it's not getting a special to help get you in, which you really need if you have both Explo and Edit, considering Edit's charge time and Explo's slow speed. It's a comp that does have some potential, and I could see it higher in future if pushed by the right players. However, we really haven't seen a whole lot of it as of late, so I really struggle to find a reason to rank it any higher, but I hope someone proves me wrong because the synergy between these weapons is still very interesting. Hopefully we see some kind of triple splashdown buff, like maybe a 70 damage outside hit. I think that would help a lot. Up next is Dread Ringer D. So I can talk about this one, I guess, because I have played a little bit of Dread D since picking up Dread myself, and originally I thought for a few maps where the beacons and wave might be stronger, like Flounder or Eeltail, that it might be a little bit better for it, but I've come to the conclusion that you could play it on those maps, but I don't think it's worth it. To be honest, I think that the kit is just a little bit too mediocre. It doesn't help the weapon's painting ability at all. Helping with the damage to make it have a more consistent kill time just is not there. Wavebreaker isn't consistent enough at hitting opponents, and beacons are just not something you want to be setting up as a Dreadringer. Your weapon paints so well, and you already have mobility problems, so having to deal with setting up beacons is just not good synergy. I do believe a lot in the main weapon, but to talk about that, we of course have to talk about Vanilla Dread. I've thought a lot about how I would rank it. I've obviously seen a lot of success with it in the western side of comp, but of course, in Japan, the weapon still does basically nothing, outside of Grand Roll getting 4,000 X power on the weapon, but that's solo queue. While in Japan, it's only had one big tournament run, getting second place in an area cup. Still, I'm going to say that I think I would not be having the success I would be having if the weapon wasn't at least this good. About S tier. Dreadringer as a main weapon is still very strong at working with other players, since it does a minimum of 35 damage with drop-off, which is going to work with almost anything. Its ability to do 90 damage can kill pretty much anyone who's even slightly weak. Its combat capabilities by itself are still pretty alright, the speed issues aren't too bad, and the painting output of the weapon is frankly quite ridiculous. The kit on the weapon is also pretty good. With Last Ditch Effort, you can use a lot of bombs and a decent amount of them without, and it helps paint towards your special, and Reef Slider on it is fine. You do have to be really careful about your timing and how you use it. I think crab players have gotten really good at not getting their special broken by it, to the point where I don't really slider crabs as much these days. But it can still be really useful on isolated targets or doing 70 damage to a group of enemies. Cooler Q-Strike can still get you out a lot of the time. And most importantly, Reef Slider is a way to prevent the weapon from being rushed down as easily, since it has a way to get out of situations more quickly or find kills on a weapon that normally struggles to kill quickly. Compared to other supports, it's a little bit slower with much less consistent of an entry tool, and that's the main thing that holds it back. However, the weapon just has so many different things going for it, and I think when I've tested it in tournament setting, those factors still play enough of a role to where if you're playing around it and build the right comps, it can clearly see success. And I think at the end of the day, that has to put it at about S tier. So that's where I'm going to rank it. So obviously going to have some personal bias given that I play the weapon, but that's where I think it honestly does belong. So, Vimy is going to move up to D tier. It's obviously an improvement from the last list, but you might be surprised that it's only this much. Isn't the hammer buff kind of important? And, I mean, yeah, but not as much as people think. And even if it was, I think that Vimy is still kind of stuck between two roles. Obviously, the mini buffs are very nice, but at the end of the day, this weapon's a support. You don't really want your support with hammer. It's just kind of how it is. You can try to make it work for sure, but I think the team comps you're going to build are just a little bit more awkward. And for the most part, if you really want to have a burst bomb support, there's just better options. And if you want a mini, there is Zimmy. This is the weapon I've debated its placement the most. Zimmy, I'm not sure if this weapon is real or not. A lot of people hyped it up after 9.0, but its results haven't quite been all there. But every now and then a Zimmy will do pretty well. So yeah, I'll give it S tier, and the 9.3 patch really only solidifies the fact that this could really be this far up now that it charges even faster. Next up is Heavy Splatling Deco. I'd say that anchor weapons have gotten a lot more picky about the kinds of specials they get. If you're gonna replace a pencil or edit with cooler, it's gotta be something really worth it. And you can probably see where both heavies are gonna falter here. Kraken is okay. Sometimes you'll be more aggressive with heavy and it'll allow you to do that, and then Censor's kind of useful for a niche, of course. Though it doesn't help that there is a Censor Nautilus that does that niche a little bit better. For the most part, there just really isn't a need to have Kraken on the heavy of all things, and if you want to be more aggressive, there are better options to pick than heavy even in the anchor class. Even if I don't rank it that much higher, I think a bit better pain output of Sprinkler and keeping the main weapon active to control space with Wavebreaker gives a little bit more utility to work off, while still allowing heavy access to both playstyles. So for the most part, I think Deco really struggles to see use over the original, but the original still has largely the same problems, even if the kit is marginally better. This is one that I see having more potential if Wave becomes more worth it of a special to have, but until those buffs start happening, there's almost always going to be a better option in comp. Especially now that the main weapon was just buffed even further. I don't even really think it needed that, but like, again, it'll just really go to show that the problem is not the main. Octobrush Nouveau is up next. I think that now the meta has shifted into more mid-range weapons again, it's not good for Octobrush. To me, this weapon really thrives against short-range weapons or very slow and precise aiming mid-range weapons, which really only has the blasters as something it could do well into, but S-Blast, the main one that's picked right now, has a short-range mode made for dealing with weapons like this. Maybe if the roll was a little bit faster I could see it, but that paired with this kit with Beacon and Inkstorm, and I just don't really see it. Inkstorm doesn't really have too much synergy, nor is that strong a special like I've talked about previously, and while Octobrush is okay at setting up beacons, it does make its disadvantage state a little bit awkward, though at least the special is a bit cheaper at 180p. That said, I do think there's more potential for Vanilla Octo, but not as much. To be honest, I think Luna Blaster being buffed is the main reason I'm moving Octobrush down slightly. In terms of having a bomb and a zip caster, it's the same kit. Octobrush gets a little bit more value out of caster, but I'd argue that Luna is past it in terms of main weapons. Yeah, it's not as mobile and doesn't pain as much, but it's much better at kill power, and its blast radius is much stronger of a strength, with a direct hit to work around for a faster kill time, while Octobrush doesn't have it. It doesn't help that this weapon also competes with Tri Nouveau, which has a much more reliable and faster kill time with a bit more range. This unfortunately just puts Octobrush in between two better weapons for an already very niche role, and while I think it could be higher around even with Luna if pushed properly, the weapon sees less and less optimal use cases for it as the meta progresses. And up next, I'm going to rank both Paintbrushes, just barely making it into the viability tier. I think Paintbrush as a weapon is still incredibly slow and doesn't paint enough for it to be used as a supportive kit. This weapon has similar range to Tri, but much worse of a kill time, especially when you take into account the startup. The mobility on the weapon feels incredibly limited, and that's where at least the vanilla kit helps a little bit. I think that Curling Bomb makes the mobility easier, and at least Wavebreaker is an ink tank refill that can combo for a one-shot if the weapon's up close. I know, we're really grasping at straws here. The object damage on the weapon can be useful, and it can definitely catch some people off guard who aren't familiar with its playstyle. While the Nouveau kit doesn't provide as much natural synergy, I do think Sensor and Missiles is a very synergistic kit for the sub and special, giving you a lot of ways to locate people, while the main weapon is good at taking care of sharking weapons approaching it. However, with a weaker paint output than usual, I think that the output of Missiles is unfortunately just a little bit low for what it wants to do. Definitely a weapon that can get better if its stats are tuned a little bit more. I think that the only real potential behind this weapon is with tent comps, since Tenebrella Shield gives it a way to approach and make up for its speed, where the extra range the weapon has over other brushes can be made more useful. But still, as the meta gets faster and faster, it's really tough to have a weapon this slow work. And the buff definitely helps this weapon. Its paint and kill time being increased are definitely noteworthy, but it's still stuck in between two roles while not being able to play either one perfectly. Maybe with 10 comps a little bit of potential could be there, but I think between the kit and main weapon's problems with the startup, there's unfortunately just a little bit too much here for me to put any higher. Up next is Glooga Dooley's Deco. I don't have too much to say about Glugas because this is still a weapon I really struggle to find, what to say about it. It's still one that I think I have some of the least understanding of. The main weapon's 2-shot can be threatening when it gets into a dodge roll, but the main weapon's pain output and mobility are very limited otherwise, so this means it takes up a Slayer slot, and I think this isn't a kit that makes up for its weakness. However, Sensor and Zuka is a totally fine kit by all means that still has a good amount of power behind it. But of course, when talking about Gluga, we're mostly going to be talking about this Gluga. I think that Wall and Booyah is essential to making up for the main weapon's weakness, as it gives you more survivability, especially paired together, and we know from K52 and S2 how annoying this kit can be. This one isn't capable of getting as many Booyah bombs, but I still think there's a lot of potential here. It's a strong kit, a very long-reaching 2-shot kill, and a decent main weapon when it comes to painting thanks to the buffs. That being said, the lack of overall tournament use means I really can't place it higher than C tier, and overall I think while the kit is powerful, the main weapon really is still struggling to find its footing in terms of what comps it would be played with and what it's good at. It seems like this weapon has more weaknesses to exploit than strengths it's able to play off of, but if I could be wrong about any weapon, this is probably the one with the most potential to be wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if a good Gluga player was able to show up and win a tournament, mostly just given how powerful the kit is. You know what? I think I'm gonna put it in a B tier. The more I talk about this weapon, the more I'm convincing myself that it does have some potential. At the end of the day, I think the buffs to Booyah making the kit incredibly powerful are the reason I'm gonna end up bumping it up to B tier. So yeah, we'll put it there, and hopefully someone is able to show off what this weapon can do one day. And up next are the Brellas. I've had tier list after tier list of putting them in around the B tier and saying that they have some potential, but enough time has passed. This is where they go to me. Brella sees basically no use anymore these days, and it struggles even more with matchups than it did before. S-Blast can hit around it, HP specials can tank the damage, swords are melting your shield, and more HP specials just give other ways to tank against yours. Crab Ball Form can break your shield, Bubble can break your shield. There's just more and more added problems, with Bubble also working well against Sorella's Inkjet. While Sorella Brella has a more synergistic kit, Inkjet isn't as strong as it used to be previously, and I think it really struggles in this meta. It especially hurts that Inkjet struggles against a lot of the same things that Brella does, such as swords, blasters, and primarily chargers. The vanilla kit, while being 10 points more expensive and not having as good a sub, with Sprinkler only helping to get more of those strikes, at least has a special that's easy to use. Granted, you're not often in positions where you want to use Tri-Strike, but at least Strike is an easy special to get value out of. As for the main weapon, I really can't tell what this is trying to be. It doesn't paint anywhere near as enough to be a good support, so this is often taking a fighting weapon slot for a weapon that can barely fight. The damage on it is just pathetic, and the shield is struggling more and more as the meta progresses. Ultimately, I don't think the main weapon is completely terrible, but the difficulty curve in order to get just moderate value out of it just isn't worth it at all. Recycle Brella is one I've had to think about. Obviously, it's in discussion with the 9.3 buffs, but I'm gonna put it here. I feel like this is fair. Recycle is still really slow, the shield is still really bad, and I don't think it's even that amazing of a fighter because of, the two qualities I just mentioned. But now it paints pretty well. Not, like, amazing by any means, but enough to actually get it special, and this one does have a special. So yeah, I do feel like that's enough for it to jump placements this highly. You can play for Bubble, use that to enhance the main weapon's fighting power, kind of just throw out shields for the extra paint. It's okay, but the weapon shield is still really, really bad. I'm glad it at least has a little bit more of an identity, though. The paint has made it a lot more flexible, so that's a good start, even if we are very late at doing it. Moving up to C tier, first up is the NZAP 89. Now yes, this is 170 for Super Chump, but Super Chumps come on a 10-second cooldown, which kind of balances it out outside of the start of the game where you can obviously get them very quickly. And for the most part, as you might imagine with a lot of shooters that are very dependent on their kits, the support special of Super Chump is the main reason it ranks so low. Zap is a fine weapon and Autobomb gives it some nice support utility. I think it's totally okay in this meta. However, I don't see a big need for Super Chump as a support or really in general. It could be okay for comps that want more paints, but then you're pretty much always going to be picking Neo Splash. I don't think it's even that much worse since you get a little bit better fighting power, a combo damage number, and an auto bomb, but the gap between Tri-Strike and Super Chump is just a little too vast here. When talking about NZAP 85, it's a lot harder to rank since it's hard to distinguish Zap's solo viability while also taking into account the weapons you can run with it. However, the absolute peak of weapons that are worth running a Zap is something like Red Pen or E-Liter, which isn't going to be much higher on this list. Rapid Pro Deco is the highest ranked non-cooler anchor, and that can be played with edit, so for the most part Zap isn't that needed for those comps. As a main weapon, it's pretty much the same as what I said earlier, but you have a little bit better of a bomb for support since it has a bit better of a painting radius and a bit more consistent damage, but for the most part this is still just going to be a short range cooler covering a special that you more than likely wouldn't need. However, it'll of course be a necessity for comps that want to run a cooler and don't have an edit and pen. So I think that lands it in about A tier because that's about where the weapons in those comps are going to land. Next up is the Bamboozlers. Bamboo Mach 2 is going to be ranked here, and we just have a consistent pattern with the specials being the main limitation for these, because like with NZAP 89, it's Super Chump that really keeps this back. The Fizzy Bomb paired with Bamboo is amazing, and the Chump paired with it works very well too. However, Bamboo 2 comps are usually going to need help getting in, and with those entry tools, there is Bamboo 1 that has a much better and more consistent special in terms of output due to not having as drastic of a cooldown. I will give Mach 2 a shout out for at least having insane paint output with the Fizzy plus Chumps, even if toned back a little bit recently. That does give it some niche use cases at least, but for the most part, I think you're going to be picking Bamboo Mach 1, which is what I would put in about B tier. It has a 10-point cheaper killer whale and a bomb I can use a little more often since it's cheaper, so also a very synergistic kit. I think that Bamboo as a main weapon does have a speed advantage. It's good against some midline matchups, though not amazing against them, but there's a very harsh difficulty curve, and most importantly, the comps you're running with the weapon are very tricky to make work since you're obviously ditching the classic pen or edit. Maybe edit Bamboo could have some kind of potential, but I think there's probably a reason we haven't seen it tried basically at all yet. So for the most part, Bamboo really lacks any sort of prominent results for it to be ranked much higher than it is here. And that brings us to our next charger, where we're going to be talking about the E-Leader. I'm going to try to get Kraken Leader out of the way real quick because I think Kraken Leader is significantly worse than Vanilla Leader on most maps. Leader isn't really a weapon that wants to take time setting up beacons, that it'll occasionally be able to if there's massive downtime, like if a team fight is won pretty handily and you don't have anyone to snipe. And Kraken on it, while useful if people get close to you, you're kind of playing the weapon that keeps people away from you. Something like a Heavy Deco could at least get close enough to use it by being more aggressive, but Custom Leader is rarely in the scenario where it wants to pop Kraken like that, which means it often loses a lot of value. It also has basically no way of bailing itself out if Kraken ends and you're near a target. None whatsoever. On top of that, it's 210 points for special. As you might have guessed, I think that Vanilla Leader is much better. I'm going to rank it at an A tier for now, but I could see it as high as S if people continue to push the weapon, because it does have a few strengths about it, but of course let's first talk about the weapon kit. I do really like the Ink Mine Wavebreaker kit for it. It's one of those that would be absolutely perfect for the weapon if Wave was balanced better, and it's really the only thing holding it back. I think that the doubling up of location and damage to work off of makes it really annoying to rush the weapon down, while it also has more utility, like helping you hold a zone, checking flanks, or Wavebreaker being able to help with teammates approaching. Having tools that consistently help Leader and its team while keeping the main weapon active make it a much better kit, even at 210 points for special. Unfortunately, getting so few specials that are going to be Wavebreakers is a big downside for this weapon. If it got a better special, I think it would be a lot easier to use, so hopefully we see a wave buff one day. But outside of that, Leader as a main weapon is very interesting. Mostly because it's one of the few weapons that has a matchup advantage over Pencil due to the extra range and one-shot, and it's pretty good into edit comps as well since edit has to peek against it. Leader forces a very different type of game to be played, where resources have to be used against it and fights taken outside of its sight lines, but when you get map control, an E-Leader team can be more oppressive than a Pencil team when done correctly. However, there's still a lot of pressure on being able to hit shots, dealing with opposing specials, such as killing Crab or Trizuka users when possible, same for other specials it's able to deal with, and at the end of the day, the difficulty is still quite a lot there. So it's tough to really see the consistency really work out, and on top of all these factors, you have to play with an NZAP. Not really a weapon you super want to play with. It's there kind of as a necessity because you can't play with the other two. So paired with all those factors is the reason I don't see it being any higher, though again, if it does a little bit better in the future, S is about the highest I see its maximum potential. Slosher Deco is the most disappointing weapon to rank on this list, possibly. A Bucket with Zipcaster is incredibly synergistic and such a cool concept, and Bucket and Zip are such strong mains and specials that it absolutely hurts to say that this is torn down by Dart. Dart hinders a lot of weapon kits, but I think Bucket Deco may be the most hindered one by a lot. It truly is not worth it. The only thing it does is give you a slightly faster kill time in exchange for taking away all your reliability. It's just completely not worth the ink cost. And even more importantly than that, it doesn't help you farm your special. Vanilla Slosher is able to get more of its 210p Tri-Strike than Bucket Deco's 180 Zipcaster. There is a path forward to the weapon, give it a very low points for special, and find a way to buff Dart's paint, I guess. But for the most part, it really sucks that I don't even see a way that it's going to be practically better. Even if we get line damage, the one thing that could save the sub, do you really think it's going to do enough to combo with Bucket 70? Probably not. Unfortunately, the utility for Dart on this weapon just doesn't work. It's a situational combo at best and a downside in literally every other area. And yes, I really do believe it's that large of a downside to move it down here when Vanilla Bucket's kit is just better. The only thing it has going over Bucket is that the special is a little more synergistic to its aggressive playstyle, but that's just not worth all the other downsides it has. Truly unfortunate it has to be this low. Up next is the Ballpoint Splatling. It's going to also land in C tier, and like with Rapid Deco, man, it hurts putting a kit this low. It really feels like it should be slightly higher. But it has a lot of the same problems. 210 nerfed Fizzy Paint and inconsistent inkjet output is tough for it. In addition to that, if you want to play a Splatling, Edit's in such a good spot right now, and Pencil just absolutely demolishes this weapon. That matchup is just way too extreme in Pencil's favor. I think compared to Rapids, BPC is a little bit more niche use on maps like Lemuria and Brinewater, but I still don't really see enough for me to rank it much higher than that, unfortunately. It's another one of those weapons that's really dropping off, even though it does well in solo play, and I hope that it also gets some fixes, like being 200p now that the Fizzy Paint is nerfed down, or having a slightly better inkjet or main weapon. Definitely something that deserves to be ranked higher. Next up is the Luna Blaster. Now this is one of the most changed weapons between the different tier lists, mainly because Luna Blaster has a larger blast radius than it did before, which has done a lot for the weapon, but I'm going to save those points for the Vanilla Luna. Real quick, I just want to talk about the K-Luna kit. I do think the Fizzy buffs in terms of their combat help it a little bit, but unfortunately having even less of a special and only having an Ultra Stamp is quite weak. I think that the stamp buff definitely helps it, but that the vanilla kit is definitely still the better one. Fizzy might have a little bit more synergy, and stamp throw might be a little bit more useful, but for the most part, I think a slightly cheaper special and overall better special with Zipcaster is going to provide a little bit more potential. And that's where Luna Blaster comes in. The normal one, where would this be ranked? Because this has Splat Bomb and a 170 Zipcaster. So that gives it a lot more potential, and we have the main weapon buffs. In terms of the kit, I do think the damage off Zip does combo with Luna particularly well, especially because Luna compared to other blasters has a larger 70 damage zone, making it a bit more consistent at comboing with it. However, the limited range of the special does make it more limited than stuff like Stamper, Bucket, or even Tetra. The bomb on it is obviously pretty useful, and Luna's ink efficiency is pretty good, but what about the main weapon itself? I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for. The larger blast radius makes it difficult to space against it up close, much easier that it'll catch people off guard. Its ability to hit behind corners is extremely increased, allowing it to control space, and most of all, the larger radius means its range value now more closely matches that of other short-range weapons like shooters, meaning it's much more likely to find fights with them. I think it has some good matchups into meta weapons. If it gets up close, it can kill much faster than S-Blast or Bucket. And against Splatanas, the direct can still kill them if they're trying to slash you up close. However, this weapon does really struggle to get in sometimes. It can't get its special too easily, even at 170p, due to being a blaster, and really, it just lacks a bit of range compared to the other fighting weapons. I think this is a weapon that really excels on close range maps, in particular, ones that have a lot of cover and allow it to get up close is where I think it's very powerful, but the maps where you can get walled out can be really rough for this weapon. That being said, I've debated this weapon's placement a lot more than anything else, and I'm going to put it in B tier for now. I think the weapon's good enough to be viable at a solo main, but it really excels being picked on the shorter range maps that it can thrive in, and I think it's better to play this alongside another blaster that can cover the range deficit more, whether that be range blaster, S blaster, or even normal blaster would work a little bit better on the weaker maps compared to it. Another blaster I'm going to be ranking here is the Custom Blaster. Now, Custom Blaster is a bit of a tough weapon to rank because I think this is the ultimate noob stomper weapon. I don't even like using the term noob stomper for it because The level at which Custom Blaster works is actually quite high. This weapon can work at very high levels very effectively, and I do think it's worth using in some situations. And Triple Splashdown can also be a good tool to force trades with it. Where it really struggles is when you're fighting much higher level comps with a lot of these more powerful midlines, is where Blaster struggles in these matchups and needs tools to deal with it. Which, there is a Blaster that does that very well, but it's not this one. Which is why V-Blaster will be a little bit higher at A tier. I think that the Auto Bomb and Big Bubbler is a lot more valuable, not just being stronger options, but ones that help Blaster a little bit more, since Bubble can be useful to help hold space against longer range options, as well as is a lot more consistent than Triple Splashdown, while Auto Bomb provides a little bit more utility and something to do when out of its range value. Like Nautilus, Vanilla Blaster is really a weapon that excels against short range comps, and so doesn't do as well versus midline oriented ones, but when it's fighting the right weapons, its ridiculous lack of end lag compared to other blasters still makes it a very valuable option against those comps. Up next is the S-Blast 92. So obviously S-Blast 91 is ranked extremely highly, and you might have guessed it, the reason it's down here is because the kit really is that much worse. I will say Slider works a little bit better as a panic option, and is better in terms of speed. However, its big blast radius means that oftentimes the mode you're using to combo out of it is the long range one that's not really that consistent compared to other options. The short range one is okay if they're close enough, but it's not very consistent, and having to guess between two firing modes considering Slider's explosion does kind of blind your screen for a little bit, just while it blows up, means that this combo is extremely inconsistent. You do get more of them because of Sprinkler, but why would you ever want a Sprinkler on a fighting weapon like this? The best utility you can get out of it is using it to block shots a little bit, like jump, short range mode, throw it at your feet, jump and shoot again and hope it blocks shots. I've done that a little bit back when 91 wasn't out, but these days, when you can have Burst Booyah, there's basically no reason to put it here. The only reason it's even ranking this high is because Slider is decent on it and the main weapon is still pretty good, but the other kit basically enhances everything that makes the main weapon strong to the point where you're really just only using this if you want to. Up next is Rapid Blaster, and as much as I wish I could put a gap between these two, I'm actually going to be ranking both of these Rapids in the same tier. I still think that Rapid Deco is definitely the better of the two. However, the reason they're in the same tier is because I think the slightly cheaper Tri-Strike is a lot more consistent of a special than Inkjet. I've talked a few times already about Inkjet's consistency problems, but paired with Rapid, it is at least a little bit better. I think Rapid's Torp is able to do a lot of damage, and it feels very weird that Rapid Deco is all the way down here in C tier, because on paper, it seems like a fine main weapon with a really strong kit, but when you look at it, there's just a lot of holes. The main weapon doesn't really do as well against other midlines as Rapid Pro since it lacks the range advantage, Torp combos don't work anywhere near as well as they did in Splatoon 2, and Jetpack is a very inconsistent special that, even if it wasn't, is also 210 points for special, and doesn't have a lot of gear freedom to run special power-up to make it more consistent. All of these smaller problems have just really added up, and I think a number of these need to be addressed in order for the weapon to be much higher. Another reason it's down here is just a lack of people pushing it. I think that it probably could belong in about a B tier in an ideal world, but if someone's not able to get a decent run with it, I just really don't have a reason to put it higher other than my personal bias. As for V-Rapid, it sees basically the same amount of use at this point, and while it's a much less synergistic kit that doesn't take advantage of the more aggro potential this weapon has, having a special that's just a lot better and a sub that's still functional, and having a sub that's still solid, even if it's not as good, is enough to put it around the same tier. Even though the weapons seem so similar to each other, I can't stress enough how much Rapid Pro absolutely dunks on Rapid in terms of usability in this meta. I think that if they want to help Rapid out, outside of, potentially buffing Inkjet and the Torp combos again, the main weapon could be due for some buffs like Lightweight to give it a little bit more gear freedom for its special, or just in general buffing it in a way that makes it a bit of a stronger fighting weapon, since oftentimes it's sharing range values with stuff like Range Blaster that have a lot easier of a time dealing with it. But we'll see if they do anything to it in the future. Until then though, it unfortunately has to be ranked this low. I guess I'll put Rapid Pro here as well. This is a tough one to rank because Rapid Pro is in a much better spot than Rapids. I know the main weapon isn't that different, but it's so much easier being the anchor slot or just having the range value to contest other mid lines without being shot back and killed in the same range. It really does make a big difference, but obviously you know what holds this back by now. It's the kit. But there's some decent main weapon synergy making up for it. I guess I could see it on a few maps, but realistically not over the other one that much. Dart on it is very situationally useful at best with a damage combo that often isn't worth the ink tank. but replacing the special with Killer Whale is very useful. It pairs very easily with other meta weapons like Stamper. It can help edit comps approach more easily, and this weapon works very well for chip damage with other strong options like Burst Bombs and Crab from the Splash-O-Matic, Platana Stamper, Decapitator, Slosher, or really any strong meta weapon pairs very well with this, and again, Whale is a very good option for it. I would say that this mostly thrives in longer range maps where it could do a bit better than S-Blast, as I don't think it's particularly worth it over S-Blast on most maps, but that being said, it's seeing more and more success with edit comps. I think its kit is working out a little bit better, and its matchups and synergy both with and against other meta options are propelling it higher and higher. Definitely an S tier pick in my eyes, especially good on the right maps, but can work pretty much anywhere. And up next is Ink Brush. Ink brushes, I'm going to talk about the main first for this because it's kind of important to talk about it first because they just have such a different game plan than other weapons. Very much a run around, distract, get behind enemies, and a lot of it is going to be based around its ability to consistently get around opponents. I think Brush's biggest weakness right now is its kill time. You have to be very close to take out opponents, and a lot of weapons have ways of dealing with it, like mince larger hitbox, S-Blast short range mode, bucket sloshing around. You get the idea. Or even worse if you have to deal with an edit that has the mobility to strafe around you. That means its matchups against a lot of the higher tier weapons are going to be very tricky, and in addition to that, the maps make it very tough. So it's important that a kit really compensates around it in the best way possible, and this one is okay at it. Splat Bomb is nice for it. 180p is a ridiculously cheap whale that makes it very spammable. However, if you're playing to spam the bomb and the whale, you're not going to get a whole lot out of the brush. And unfortunately, this kit is left waiting for its whale as an option to get in enough, and then when it does get in, its kit doesn't allow it to take full advantage of being in that position. Which is why Ink Brush Nouveau actually stacks slightly higher. Yeah, it doesn't have tools to get in that position, but it has tools to make that position much more annoying. Having Ink Mine set up when Brush is behind you, as well as dealing with Ultra Stamp, which, while it isn't great on most weapons, Brush is one of the better ones at getting in positions to use it, and it can use it more to stall and keep itself in those positions. Stamp isn't a great entry tool, but Brush's mobility kind of helps make up for that. So Stamp serves as another factor when having to deal with Ink Brush, and it being a lightweight weapon that runs swim speed does also indirectly help a lot with the quality of the stamps. That being said, it's not that much better. I think that it still struggles a little bit too much in getting in with these maps, which is just going to be a problem until the end of time with Splatoon 3, unless we somehow get a content extension with more reworks, and a stronger kit does not exist with tools to make up for those weaknesses. This is another one that, again, slightly benefits from the brush buff, but I don't think really changes it too much. Up next is the N-Parry Splat Dualies. You might have guessed it, but the regular dualies exist. N-Parry does not combo for a one-shot off of its splashdown. The curling bomb with it has some synergy, though it's not worth losing the bomb, and for the most part this is a much more linear dualie trying to mimic a Tetra, and in that case, you would just rather have a Tetra. I'll at least give it some points that triple splashdown works for it better than Reef Slider in a lot of situations in terms of Tetra, but when it's facing that harsh of competition with a weapon that's specialized to play that specific way, I don't really see how N-Parry is going to benefit. Unless if they buff splashdown to actually work off this weapon, making it a lot more threatening for random kills, I just don't think that this is super worth it. It's not that bad by any means. Dualie is a solid main weapon at fighting, can paint a decent amount, and splashdown has its moments, but for the most part, if you want to take advantage of Dualie's flexibility, you're gonna pick the other one. Which has been more importantly. The most recent results we've seen from Dualies, which was very high for it, placing first and second in an area cup, was it being played as the support, with comps that can cover its paint output a bit. It's not being played as aggressively like N-Parry wants, it's playing more supportively. Still closer to fighting than other support weapons, obviously, but that's what it's taking advantage of. When looking at it with those attributes, Suction Bomb Crab is a great flexible kit that allow you to play more supportively when you need to, while you can also use Crab to enhance the weapon's fighting capabilities, especially given that you can roll out of it when the Crab is broken. And another positive it has over Splash is 30 damage, working with a lot of meta weapons better that do 70. Originally, this was going to be ranked a little bit lower because it's been struggling a lot more as a fighting weapon, but since it's now able to properly compete with the support role, I see a big future with Dualies where honestly it could even be a tier higher than S on this list, but for now I'm going to put it here as we continue to see Dualies develop in this new playstyle. Though you are still losing on the Burst Bomb combo damage for a lethal, which is worth it sometimes, but not other times. Next up are Tetra Dualies. I'm going to rank light Tetras down here and get it out of the way first with how active this weapon is is at running in and dying, the sub is much more important than the special unless if the gap is large. And in terms of how Tetris plays, the gap is not large. Unfortunately, this is another cool Zipcaster kit gutted by its sub, in this case being Sprinkler. I guess it's slightly less gutted than Bucket Deco. Not that normal Tetris fares much higher, but I'm gonna put it into B tier. Realistically, I think Tetra running it down 24/7 isn't super necessary. A lot of main weapons have ways of dealing with it, and while Slider on it is okay, it lacks threatening combos out of it, and doesn't really want to use the supportive utility. It can still extend kill streaks, get you behind opponents, and gives you one more thing to deal with, but now that Slider is a much more flexible and powerful special, I don't think it works anywhere near as well with Tetra as it used to. I think Triple Splashdown is a much better candidate. However, as a main weapon, this is the reason it's ranked higher than something like End Parry. Having 4 dodge rolls gives you the ability to stall your death much more often, take a bit better fights, and ultimately is more specialized into that playstyle. That playstyle isn't as useful these days, as coolerless comps don't really want a Tetra over having other weapons that have specials to get you in, and cooler weapons have other dually options that are better in terms of both slaying and support, but Tetra's still fine. Its main is still a lot better than it gets credit for, it's just very difficult, and the ability to take fights more often than other weapons is still valuable, even if not as much as it used to be. After that is custom Dowser dualies, another weapon with a really strong kit. Burst Bomb and Tri-Strike is basically perfect for it. I guess if you're ran down, Tri-Strike isn't the best option, but you have the range to deal with it, and Burst Bomb is amazing for working off of players in this meta, which means if it's ranked this low, it's because of the main. Dowser has a lot of potential as a main weapon. It's led to me ranking it a lot higher originally when it released. However, what's clear to me now is that Dowser does not have the stats. Dowser wants to play more similarly to a Jet Squelcher, where it can hang back and paint the map more safely, but also use its Burst Bomb and more aggressive potential to take fights much more actively than any other anchor. However, Dowser has 26 damage instead of 32, it has less range, and much more importantly than all of those, the paint on it is not good enough. I cannot stress this enough. Unless if you really buff a lot of other stats, this weapon will not be good until it paints the floor. This has to be played as either the support slot on an edit comp where it can play more aggressive, or as the backline comp in a backless comp. I don't think this is really a weapon you want to run with Pen. And while I see some potential for running it with edit splatling, the problem with that comp becomes mostly the paint. Maybe there's some theoretical like decav edit custom Dowser comp you can run with a +1 other weapon that has enough paint to cover it, but I don't know if it's super worth it then. I think the main weapon stats just aren't there in order to really make it thrive, and this should be a weapon that enables new styles and comps in terms of how you play. It lacks the stats to really do the things it's trying to do. After that, we got the bows, and I'm gonna rank both V-Bow and Inkline together. Now, I will say, Inkline is much better than V-Bow. I can't say it's a tier higher just barely, but I do think it's better. Sprinkler and Super Jumps combined with Bow's better paint output compared to Chargers just gives you a lot of turf to work off of, which is pretty useful. However, V-Bow's Killer Whale is a little bit better of a special, but sometimes synergizes better with certain comps, such as if you have a Zipcaster, as well as working on certain maps like Crab Leg. So at the end of the day, I'm fine with them being in the same tier. For the most part though, I think the main weapon is just really struggling. Even if it had better kits, Tri-Stringer is ridiculously hard. The one-shot is inconsistent to land against a lot of the heavy mobility that people are running, and its chip damage is a little bit difficult to work off of with how small the AoE is, and without having the ability to spread it out as much as something like Wellstring does. The only area where I think this has been improving in is the amount of HP specials it has to deal with, like Crab, Booyah Bomb, and Big Bubbler. However, I think the faster paced nature of the meta prevents it from having as good use cases as compared to Crab meta, where it did see use for damage into objects, because that was one of the slowest paced metas we had. Overall, while I think that Tri-Stringer does have some strengths, they're all locked behind massive difficulty curves and comps that are very tricky to run around them. Again, you don't really want to be with an N-Zap right now, and weaker specials makes it harder to get in. So ultimately, I think Tri-Stringer is just not worth the effort. And last on our C tier ranking is Wiper Deco. It's crazy how much of a scare this weapon was on launch, but nowadays I think it is very average. Missiles for it are okay. It's a good special that it'll get a decent amount of, but the main weapon doesn't really have ways of playing around very supportively. The beacons are nice to set up sometimes, but it doesn't help with the special's massive cooldown problems. That being said, if Wiper gets behind people, it can set up beacons, and it will have ways to do so due to the fact that the weapon's ink efficiency is solid, and it has good enough mobility to move around more quickly. However, the main reason this is so low is the kit really lacks ways of helping with the main weapon's damage problem, the low output of missiles being the only thing to really help do so, whereas the vanilla Wiper constantly has ways to threaten extra damage that you have to deal with. That's very important for Wiper's playstyle, where its kill time outside of a charge slash up close is its main weakness, and this weapon does want to space with its horizontal slashes more often than not. That said, I think it is a very powerful main weapon still. It does good object damage, the mobility is near unparalleled, it's able to consistently work with other fighting weapons, the charge slash is criminally underrated, especially after its frame buff given how much range it has and having much better shot velocity than Stamper, and it overall has a lot of different tools that can make it very tricky to pin down for a lot of the more precise weapons. Wiper is an interesting one to talk about because I think it's one of the bigger winners out of the stamp buff, notably just because the stamp throw can do 60 and it has a way of comboing off that quite easily with both a torp combo and just a charge slash. And obviously Wiper is the best weapon to have stamp, so it's going to benefit a little bit more off the nature of was already being played. I think it just adds to the potential threat since stamp really helps accelerates the weapon's kill time, and this just gives you another reason to be worried about that, as well as a way to potentially help with its range disadvantage. It's just barely shy of not being a tier above S. Like, it's very close to being high up. I could see it changing as the meta progresses. Even with buffed hammer, I think there's just a bit of a kit gap between it and the ones above it. Next up is the B tier. This is another cutoff point where I think weapons become solo viable. Some people might have this line a little bit higher, but for me, this is about where I think weapons could start winning on their own, or at least mostly picked on their own. And to start off this tier, let's start with the 52 Gal Deco. So as a main weapon, 52 is very strong. It is the best short-range shooter in the game in terms of stats. I think the only one that competes with it is Splash, which even then I don't think the perfect RNG is worth the reduction in range and kill time. 52's damage is very good. The follow-off range before it 3-shots is very far away. It paints pretty well and paints pretty far away. And of course, just the kill time is ridiculously fast for a 2-shot. However, compared to the other shooters, 52 is given a more aggressive kit and more aggressive playstyle, which is where I think it lacks a little bit because 52 as a main weapon is very selfish. While it is a strong main weapon in its own right, it does very little to help its team. If I compare it with Squeezer, for example, which is another weapon that has similar problems with it, Squeezer still at least does enough damage to work off of weapons like Pen and Bucket with one hit, and more importantly, has the range to be able to tag that damage further away than most options. Being short range, 52's only real impact is providing a little bit extra paint than most weapons, which often isn't worth losing the range or combo numbers compared to most midline options. 52 Deco in particular is lower because its kit isn't really worth playing around. Curling Bomb is, again, very selfish, only helping the weapon get in, and while Splatter Color Screen provides some team utility, the special is very underpowered and typically only works for roller comps. And even then, if you're trying to build around roller, oftentimes running the other 52 that can be a little bit more selfish and pull attention directly will be a little bit more helpful than an occasional screen, which is going to get countered by the point sensor ran against most roller comps anyway. Vanilla 52 isn't going to be that much higher though, and I think this might be a ranking that people are a little bit surprised with. I do think 52 is one of the better weapons in A tier, but why is it not any higher when it's definitely a better main weapon than a lot of weapons higher up than it? And that's, again, because I think in a metagame where it's all about helping teammates, 52 doesn't really do that. The wall provides more self-sufficiency and enables the main weapon to play a little more to its strengths, but its special of Killer Whale 5.1 is often used very selfishly and isn't something that synergizes with 52 too well, since a lot of the whale needs to hit to save a shot to kill, which isn't that impactful for 52. The whale is probably the best thing it has going for it in terms of teammates, since it can help them out a little bit, but it's still not something you're going to get too often unless you intentionally play for it, which I haven't seen many 52s go for. If you're running this as the short-range weapon, you're often losing out on very valuable support utility like a more consistent entry special or burst damage to work off of teammates, or even a lethal bomb, whereas if you're playing it as a slayer, you're losing a weapon that works very easily off of other damage, as well as even more of a problem, losing out on a lot of range. I could still see 52 being higher, however, I think there is a good reason it's not seen in a lot of the comps at the highest level of the game right now. While it is a very strong selfish weapon, its toolkit doesn't work super well with others. So it tends to see the most success paired with other more selfish weapons like Roller or Squeezer, but even then, I think those weapons don't really have a need for 52 other than themselves, since I believe the main weapon and kit combinations are stronger and a little bit more flexible. Still though, not a bad weapon by any means. Up next is Splattershot Pro, and I'm actually going to rank both of these in the same tier, which is a little bit surprising for me. I originally debated if Forge would be a little bit higher since it's seen a bit more use lately, but I still haven't seen it take off completely. I think Splattershot Pro has become a little bit more well-rounded into trying to be more of a support weapon as the buffs go on, getting better specials, cheaper specials with points for special buffs, and better paint output. However, while the main weapon's damage is pretty good right now at a solid 45 damage and the paint range is pretty good, I think the main weapon is just a little bit lacking in support capabilities to be a standard option for it, even though both of its kits can be quite good for it. While Dart is terrible, it is still a 180p crab on a weapon that can paint further away than Splash, and Forge Splattershot Pro has Suction and Booyah, which is one of the better supportive kits in the game, and Booyah leans to its nature of being a little bit more aggressive at times by giving you a potential way out of bad situations. It's definitely good enough to start seeing some use right now, however, I think the stats are still a little bit lacking to be ranked higher up on this list. They either need to spec a little bit more into its paint or fighting capability for it to be a true staple support right now, but it's definitely much closer than it's ever been before. Up next is going to be H3D. I feel very similarly about this weapon as I do with 96. The difference is I think the main weapon is a little bit less strong, but in exchange you have a bubbler instead of a Kraken, which is a lot better. For the most part, H3 is still in an awkward role where it doesn't paint quite well enough or have enough uptime to be a support, but as a Slayer is a little bit slow to be able to function. However, with Wall and Bubble, it can be a little bit of a tank at times that can be very difficult for certain comps to take down, and maybe could be more worth it if we see people push the weapon accordingly. That being said, I wouldn't hold my breath by any means. While I think this weapon has a chance of working, the difficulty curve is just very high, and I think a lot of the faster comps are still going to be able to run it over before it can set up its defensive resources properly. Up next is Firefin, in probably the lowest ranking I've put it for a while. I think I've overrated Firefin for quite a bit because a strong kit with a charger like that just seems to be fine. However, the thing that's really convinced me that this weapon has to be overrated in my eyes is the fact that we've seen a lot more leader over it, and I've been very confused at that because this kit, in theory, is just way better. And I do think it is way better. That's probably one of the best parts about the weapon is the wall and 210p tri-strike, while a little bit lower in output, is very strong. However, I think the issue with Firefin right now is if you want to be more aggressive with the charger like this, pencil players have gotten very good at doing it, and while it is slightly different, I don't think it's as worth as I thought previously to run a Zap to be able to have what's basically just a one-shot and slightly different kit. There is definitely potential with this weapon, but it seems that most people who are dedicating themselves to chargers would prefer to have one that has a better matchup and more oppressive advantage state like Leader has compared to something like Firefin, especially when going against weapons like Pencil and Edit Splatling. Still though, I can totally see ZF working, and I don't think the gap between it and E-Leader is that large, but it is interesting to see how much less it's being played right now, and that's, again, the main reason it's dropped off so much for me. Another weapon with two variants sharing the same tier is going to be Sloshing Machine, with both the Vanilla and Neo being placed here. I've talked about this weapon a little bit in the Meta History series more recently, and in general, I think the consensus is quite understood at this point, which is that the weapon is just not able to kill fast enough. That 5-frame nerf was just unfortunately a little bit too much, and while I think both of Machine's kits are very strong, the main weapon kind of is in a similar spot to Rapids in the fact that it doesn't really fully function as an ability to be a full-on Slayer or a full-on chip damage weapon. In this case, I think its stats are a little bit better and its fighting power is a little bit more respectable. However, it's only continued to drop off more and more, and recently I think Trizuka being slightly toned back as well as Fizzy Bomb's paint making the Booyah Bomb output on a 220 PV machine has only continued to hurt it more. Yes, the kits are very good and synergistic, but at the end of the day, this weapon is being picked for a Slayer role, and it currently does not do the slaying part well enough to be warranted as one of those slots in 99% of situations. Really unfortunate to see, and given the powerful kits, I think that if there were buffs to the weapon, it would very quickly shoot up the ranks to an A or S tier weapon if it just got a few frames taken back off, or maybe 210 Booyah Bomb. But as it stands right now, I unfortunately just see these weapons not able to climb much higher because the main is holding them back. Up next is the Vanilla Tentabrella. I don't have too much to say about this kit. This is the most synergistic ink vacuum kit since the shield can help with it, and I think it does have the time of day to set up beacons, But for the most part, it's going to be much more worth it to pick the other kit, one of the stronger ones in the game, and is most of what I want to talk about with this weapon, which is Sorella Tentabella. Sorella Tent's Ink Mine and Trizuka is an amazing kit. The shield allows you to set up mines quite easily, and it works with the weapon's damage very well, and Trizuka can play off the location and damage off Ink Mines, as well as is a great way to deal with longer range threats, or have an option to deal with enemies behind corners that Tent can normally struggle with. As for the main weapon, we don't see it often right now, but I think the Tentabella shield, while shredded quite easily at times, is one of the best ways to stop many of the one-shot or burst damage kills that the game has right now, and that fact, along with such a strong kit, is why I rank it so highly. I really think it's very underrated just how well the shield can work at slowing down what would normally be very fast comps at getting their kills, and if you can properly play off that, I think there's a lot you can do. 10 comps are very underexplored, and I think the shield is still such a strong attribute, while the main weapon outside of the shield still has pretty solid damage, nice paint output, and a potential one-shot to help keep up with the faster kill time weapons. As much as I've talked up the main weapon, though, I do still think it has its fair share of counters, and unfortunately, paired with the Zuka nerf, I'm going to drop it down to A tier. I really want to say it's good enough to function despite that, but I do think Zuka is a huge part of the kit, and Tent gets a lot of it, so I still think it is a good weapon, but not as good anymore. So you might be surprised to see the well strings ranked together this time. Or you're not, because you realize we've been talking about the hammer buff quite a bit, and this is one of those cases where I think it's different. In my head, I think that vanilla well string is probably actually the better one now. I think it has a bit better of a chance of working alongside Edit, the stronger, cooler option when compared to Zap, and that's noteworthy, but it still has some problems. Both still probably are going to end up being played with Zap if we do see them. But I think that Wellstring is still a very solid weapon. It has good object damage. Even if it has to run Object Shredder and drop Stealth Jump a lot of the time to take advantage out of it, it still paints a good bit, and it still has a good potential for one-shots up close. Custom Wellstring was one of the best weapons at using point sensor and having a location thing, which has been why it's ranked this high. But Vanilla Wellstring joining it is because I think the hammer buff really does help with a more aggressive playstyle. You could position a little bit more forward, go in a bit more, and I think the sheer amount of hammers you get makes it a little more consistent. You'll find something with it. Along with, obviously, Wellstring does do a lot of chip damage, and 2 bullets from Wellstring can combo with the 60 hit, and it isn't exactly unfeasible that you'll be shooting a bullet and then have a hammer throw right after to follow up. I also just think it's a little bit helpful to throw hammer as entry if you really need it. Like, obviously it's not going to be as consistent value as something like a crab, but if you're in a dire situation and you need a play to happen, Stamp has a chance of making it work now, whereas Wavebreaker is not going to clutch you out of those situations. Ultimately, you have 2 kits with very different playstyles. I think most of the potential lies in Vanilla Wellstring, but ultimately you have a strong weapon, though still flawed in some ways. It struggles to build the correct comps for it, and it has a little bit of flaws with consistent killing or even object shredding sometimes, as well as the kits not being especially powerful, but I still think there's a lot of good attributes worth investing in, and this is one of those weapons that if someone were to push it, I could see a lot of room to grow. Up next are the Refluxes. I'm actually going to rank Vanilla Reflux and Reflux Deco in the same tier, a lot of B tier weapons being ranked together today. This weapon has seen more and more niche success. I think that Reflux Deco is a little bit better in more generalist situations, since the Wall and Reef Slider gives you a little bit more ways to make up for the weapon's inconsistent killing, and helps a little bit with the difficulty of the weapon, as well as can be very powerful to help take over on splat zones. However, Vanilla Reflux's supportive capabilities on maps where missiles are very strong is not to be underrated. We've seen it a lot more on stuff like Sturgeon, Barnacle, and even Flounder Heights, and I think it is well warranted. The main weapon's paint output is still very strong, and its one-shot capabilities are still pretty threatening with a fast one-shot if you can aim properly, and I think most importantly, the weapon's mobility is a very underrated attribute of it that, paired with Splash Wall for Reflux Deco, gives it a little bit more survivability that it needs against many of the chip damage comps. Reflux is not hitting a one-shot can still get pretty good damage numbers with 45 and 90 respectively, depending on the bullets, so I think there is potential for comps to work off of Reflux and make them a little more consistent, but that being said, both the kits aren't perfect by any means, with a decent bit of flaws. An awkward spot between not fully being a support or Slayer right now is what I think just barely keeps either Reflux out of being ranked any higher. And that brings us to the last weapon of this tier, the Charcoal Decapitator. While Decapitator is an incredibly powerful main weapon, I think that Charcoal struggles because, you guessed it at this point, Inkjet continues to be very inconsistent. I've seen people complain about the wall with it, and while I don't think it's as good as Suction Bomb, the ability to use it and dash slash to take space more effectively and keep your mid-range under control is very useful when used properly, However, the jetpack instead of a big bubbler really just takes away a lot of the weapon's game plan, and while Jet does have a lot of synergy with the main weapon, the inconsistent nature of Inkjet just makes it a little bit more difficult to pull off against a lot of the better comps in the game, which means for the most part, I think it's just worth using Mint instead. Anyway, continuing with this tier is Tentatek Splatter Shot. This is another weapon that debatably could have been a little bit lower because we never really see it compared to Neo Splash, and the reason it's a bit worse is because if you're going to opt for Strike on a support, you're pretty much always going to have your support turn into a painting robot. And Neo Splash is just a better painting robot. T-Tech is a little bit more flexible, the bomb is a little bit better for combat, and the points for special being 10 cheaper is nice, but for the most part, if you really want strike spam, it's going to be for comps that aren't going to care that Neo Splash is a little bit more selfish. If you want strikes and you have a fighting-based comp, you probably have a bucket. You can still make an argument for using T-Tech, but it's just very similar to other options. That being said, it's still a shot, very solid main weapon, and it's still Splat Bomb Tri-Strike. So there's only so low I can really rank something like this. Splatter Shot. I feel like this is the least talked about good weapon, and I mean, yeah, I don't got much to say either. Compared to Neo Splash, the extra bit of higher damage and range makes it a little bit better at working off of teammates, and while its paint isn't OP, it's still pretty good at getting a lot of Zuka, despite the attempted buff to change its playstyle last patch. Now you can just paint a little bit more and a little bit further away. Though obviously the Zuka nerfs did hurt this weapon. It took a special that was already consistent and made it less consistent. While not as big a deal for some weapons, given how Zuka's main trait is spamming a lot of it, I do think it bumps it down a little bit compared to where it would have been pre-patch. The main advantage of Zuka on a support is especially that you can recover from more quickly and can be very good into countering Crab. The downside is it's a lot less flexible and a lot less consistent. Still though, with a solid lethal bomb to pair with all of this, it's in a fine spot that I don't see going anywhere. Next up in A tier is Red Pencil. This is a bit of a weird weapon to rank here, and Pencil is very good right now. This kit is even pretty solid, but really, why would you play this over the other Pencil? That's why it's down here. That's it. I don't even got much else to say about this. It's just not worth to run Red Pen plus Zap. If Zap was more worth running, like maybe if it was 190, maybe we would see it. But right now, you kind of want the Pen to be the cooler option, and Rain is not as good as the specials on other short range shooters, such as Trizuka, or Big Bubbler, or Triple Ink Strike, or Crab Tank. So yeah, we just don't see it. Up next is another interesting candidate with the Nautilus. I think that not as a main weapon is something that's worth an entire video about, which should be out by this point. But I think there's a few factors holding this weapon back. First off, I think that while the main weapon is strong in fighting, it primarily works against short-range weapons and doesn't do as well against most of the midline matchups, even if it succeeds against a few of them. Like, I think it's particularly good into Decav or S-Blast. And another issue with it is I think that the weapon kits are kind of mediocre. None of them are really too exceptional, and that's kind of where the difference between the two knots is going to stem from. I think that Gold Nautilus's Suction and Triple Splashdown would be okay if it was cheaper, but at 210 points for special, you're very rarely going to have it, and most of the time the special for Nautilus is needed to cover weapons dealing with you at a distance, not up close, which is why the Vanilla Nautilus kit is a little bit higher up. While Vanilla Naut's kit isn't anything exceptional, I think that Sensor provides a little bit more niche use cases, and Storm is a little bit less likely to backfire on you, even if it won't do too much. For the most part, this is still a very solid and underrated midline. The 32 damage it has working off of Pen is an underrated strength. However, it still has a lot of things going against it, with comparable options like Zimmy and Edit being slightly better, where most of the Smiling players are obviously going to trend to. Do you know what weapon is in a very similar spot to Red Pen? Crab Edit. Yeah, like, where does Crab Edit go? Because, yeah, your Splash is going to be the Crab guy, so why would your Edit not be the cooler guy? Doesn't really make a lot of sense to downgrade to a Zap so that you can run an Edit with the Crab when it's slightly less optimal with it. I guess compared to Red Pen, you're at least making the argument that the Splat Bomb is there, but honestly, I don't think Edit really uses it sub much. The idea of having 5 full charges and basically never needing to refill your ink tank is kind of the main part about the weapon, so I don't really usually see them using the bomb much anyway, so I don't think it really matters that much. Next up on the shooters is Foil Squeezer, continuing the pattern of kits that are just inferior than another option on the list. At least for Foil Squeezer, I'd argue this is a little bit more synergistic and unique. Out of all the screen options in this game, this is definitely the best one. It does allow Squeezer to approach more easily and potentially take fights it wouldn't get away with normally, and it also gives it a way to get a bit of an information advantage over the opponents, something that Squeezer definitely benefits from. While Auto Bomb isn't as useful as Wall when trying to control open space, I'd argue that it's still very useful for scouting capabilities as well as being a normal bomb. Do I think it's worth it over the vanilla kit very much? No, not really. Unless if you're pairing it with something like Roller, maybe. If you want to do like a Roller and Splash comp, I guess I could see it. But we haven't seen too many of those, so I'm not sure how well it would fare. That said, I haven't even mentioned the biggest point of this weapon's favor, which is that it's 30 points cheaper than the other Squeezer. Yeah, that plus a bomb equals way better special output. So I guess that kinda helps bridge the gap in power, just a little. Up next for rollers is the Carbon Roller Deco. Carbon and regular roller have had a bit of competition for quite a while right now. It's very interesting to try and think about which one might be better or worse, but at the end of the day, I think that roller having a bit more consistent of a hitbox and a much better special is a bit more important. That said, Carbon does have a big claim to fame, and that is Burst Bomb. Burst Bomb is very synergistic with a lot of other meta options right now, even if those aren't too common in roller compositions, and it's just a very powerful sub. I think Zook on it still works very well, even if it's not as consistent as Bubble, and as a main weapon, while its range is a little bit lacking compared to Roller, the extra speed advantage this weapon has, particularly from being lightweight and using Burst Bombs for mobility, is still pretty noteworthy. I'd say that Carbon is still a good pick for roller styles of play, and if you play roller, you might as well do Carbon and vice versa. I think that you can definitely get away with playing both, and I've quite enjoyed seeing it. And even if it's not as common right now, it usually does well when we do see it. Up next for the blasters is going to be the Range Blaster. I do think that Range Blaster's main weapon is still pretty good right now. Even with the weaker blast radius, there's a lot more chip damage to work off the damage, making it easier to find combos to get a kill. The reason this is lower is the kit. Suction and Wave Breaker just really doesn't keep up these days, especially at 210, and as the upper echelon of weapons have gotten better and better kits, this one has fallen further and further behind. And to be honest, even in this tier here, pretty much every single other weapon ranked here has a better kit than it, at least in terms of synergy with the weapon they're attached to. Which sucks because Wave on range is really synergistic and fun, but the power level of Wave Breaker is just way too low right now. I think that if this weapon had a bit of a better special, or at least had that special be cheaper, it would be ranked a bit more highly. Still very underrated, but I think for the most part the future for Range Blaster is with custom range. While range as a main weapon is a little bit weaker due to its radius being nerfed in 9.0 and slightly lower special output, it has a lot of good qualities in this meta. The most improved of which is Kraken, which is doing way better both with and against all the HP specials as a survivability option, compared to when it was fighting stuff like Zuka and Strike that it had little impact on. It's also good for regroup since you can leave the recall in a safe position to give jumps. Range as a main weapon also has a little bit more chip damage to work off of than previously, and while weaker, the long range AoE still allows it to have good matchups against other midline fighting weapons. However, the main weapon is still a bit slower than most options, and while a little bit better, Kraken is still a little slow and easy to avoid to be able to take fights against their teammates. It's no longer the best blaster in the game, but the qualities that made it good before are still very valuable now, and it's a little bit more well-rounded, which is why I think this kit in particular is still very underrated. Onto the dualies, we have the Dapple Dualies. This weapon has still been keeping up in tournament play as it has a very fast kill time and an annoying kit to deal with. Torp and Slider can both take advantage of a lot of the slower attributes of other weapons, while Torp also helps you deal with sharking opponents, and this is possibly the best weapon with Reef Slider. Obviously Dread has more support utility with it, however the Torp combo out of it is very devastating, while the main weapon maintains much faster mobility, with dodge rolling out of the Slider being a much faster option than attacking with Dread given its startup. Therefore, I think it can use its Slider a bit more flexibly. As a main weapon, I think that Dapple is still very good. It does lack in range, obviously, but the mobility is near unparalleled and the kill time is incredibly fast, while the damage is still good enough to work off of other options, and Torp is still very synergistic as both a mini burst bomb and a scouting tool. Overall, a very powerful kit and main weapon with a very unique and specialized playstyle that's worth playing around for fast comps. I believed in the potential of this weapon since 9.0 basically, but this buff just adds to it even further. I can't understate how much this range fix really does help it seem even more consistent. Extremely underrated pick. Up next is going to be both dually sculptures. I really had a hard time separating which one I would put above the other. I think they're pretty even right now, with the vanilla dually sculpture having a slightly better bomb. They are main weapons with a relatively fast movement speed and weaker damage, but they have a lot of range and decent paint output, so they serve as great bait for rollers, or just in general can stall out fights a lot, and I think that mobility gives them an advantage against a lot of other weapons that normally have the ability to take them out quickly in terms of being able to stall out fights instead of those teammates. However, that stalling at a certain point is not as worth having the weaker kits and kill time that you get by running this weapon. Still definitely more than viable, but when it comes to working with the absolute best of weapons, they still fall a little bit short. This is another one that would really benefit from any kind of Wavebreaker buff or a slight damage buff if they want to go down that route. And that leaves the final weapon we're going to be ranking here, since again, we've already done the top 10 weapons in its own video, as Splatana Stamper Nouveau. This is one I could see having an argument for being S+, more than, especially compared to everything else here, because it is still mostly Stamper. Like with Zimmy, this is mostly just being weighed down as much as possible by Toxic Mist, but I also think that Crab on it is a little bit less strong than Zipcaster, mainly because this weapon often wants to be paired with Splash, and so it isn't as needed to have a Crab unless if it's being ran with very niche comps, such as being ran with a backless comp, for instance, where obviously having more anchoring power could be a little bit more useful given the special's power. That being said, it's still a Stamper, the high damage output of the weapon synergizes with it very well, Crab can cover AoE and add to survivability, and it's still very useful for a little bit more flexible of a Stamper playstyle that could totally work and sees decent success in the hands of the players that do want to use it over the vanilla sword. But that being said, it's hard to argue that it isn't overshadowed by its slightly better kit. Maybe buffing it down 10 points for special would help a little bit. And right before we get to the conclusion, I'm going to move one weapon up to S+, and that is Dually. It's been seeing a lot of success with Mint, S-Blast, and Pen lately in Japan. I think that combination really allows for the best use of that weapon, so I'm going to move it up. And that ends this ranking, since again, I covered the top 12 weapons in their specific order in their own video you can check out here. So, how have things changed? Generally, I think more weapons have an easier time seeing use, the top tiers are more healthy, and the balance has improved with a more healthy mixture of coordinated play and solo aggressive fighting. Though despite all of this, the most prominent issues that still reside is the balance of cooler weapons is rather bad, and the lower half of weapons still needs a lot more work when it comes to the buffs. Like I said last time though, no meta is going to be perfect, and if patches continue to improve these, I think it will stay healthy throughout Splatoon 3's endgame. This is still an improvement on an already good meta before, so I'm glad to see the shifts, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. Thank you guys so much for watching another one of these. I hope you've really enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you all in the next one.